It's time to put your thinking caps on while I talk nerdy for a bit. No pun intended. I'm going to explain RAM, VRAM, GPU, CPU, and how they affect performance in Photoshop. If most of the work you're doing is image retouching and you're dealing with larger files, RAM will make a huge difference on your computer. Designers who are creating or editing 3D graphics will need dedicated VRAM or video memory added specifically for complex functions like 3D editing. PhotoshopCS6 can run in 64-bit mode on both Mac and Windows. One important note, the way I explain or describe the difference between 32-bit architecture and 64-bit architecture is imagine your data traveling down a highway. You can have a highway that is 32 lanes, 16 lanes going one way, 16 going the other, and data traveling on it, like a car or cars. If you have a 64-bit operating system, you now have 64 lanes of traffic with 32 lanes of data going one direction or the other, and 32 on the other side. When you launch Photoshop CS6 on 64-bit Windows systems, you can open a 2 gig image 15 times faster than previous versions. Going from 32-bit to 64-bit will speed up most tasks in Photoshop by up to 6 times. If you're running on a 32-bit Mac system, something that's older, Photoshop will only address about 2 gigs of RAM even if you have more. And on Windows in 32-bit, it will only address 3 gigs of your available RAM. Now, I've jumped to Photoshop Preferences, and I'm going to go to Performance. If you're on Windows, this is under Edit, Preferences, Performance. And once Performance comes up, the memory usage is typically set at the ideal values for your operating system. Windows comes in many flavors. The Mac operating system has quite a few versions, most of them OS X these days. And here's an analogy I like to use that I got from a friend of mine when I first started working in the computer industry. Memory, or RAM, random access memory, and storage, or your hard disk, the permanent place where your images go, are like milk and gasoline. They're both measured in gallons, but you don't want to mix them up. Memory or RAM typically comes in 1 or 2 gigs on minimal systems, and power users will often buy 4 or 8 gigabytes of RAM. Hard disks come in all flavors and sizes, but today larger hard drives are anything over 100 gigabytes. You might have 500 gigabytes or 1,000 gigabytes, which is considered a terabyte. But I'm not going to be explaining bits and bytes in this. I just want you to understand that RAM is where all of your photos or images you're editing is being worked on by Photoshop. Storage are where they permanently are stored. However, if your IT department configures a computer for you that's ideal for running Microsoft Office, they may scrimp on RAM. They may only give you 1 or 2 gigs, which according to the box is enough to run Photoshop. However, that's only if you're running Photoshop and doing simple web image editing, dealing with very small files. I'm going to click OK for a moment, and you'll notice that the image I have open is 11 megs, and it's already been rezzed down. Most of my camera images are somewhere between 25 and 35 megs per image. There are some ways to see the efficiency of Photoshop. Down at the bottom left on your status bar, you can choose scratch sizes. And right now, I see 2 numbers. The number on the left of 681 megabytes is what's being used for these 3 open images, an 11 megabyte file, a 6 megabyte file, and another 11 meg file. The number on the right is how much RAM it needs to edit these images or process these images. So you'll see it's radically larger. 5 gigabytes is required to do editing for all 3 images that I have open. So that brings me back to the performance settings. On the PC, this is Edit. Down at the bottom of your Edit menu, Preferences and Performance. On the Mac, Photoshop Preferences Performance. Here you'll see scratch disks. Scratch disks are where Photoshop goes when it runs out of real RAM. And your hard drive has different sectors and tracks and an arm that jumps to different spots to write permanent data there. That physical mechanism will slow your machine to a crawl when Photoshop runs out of real RAM and has to use your hard disk to accomplish tasks. So the moral to this story is, if Photoshop seems slow to you, purchase more real RAM. When I bought my laptop, to go from 4 to 8 gigabytes was an extra $500. A year after I owned it, I was able to purchase 4 more gigs for a total of 8 for $139. RAM got very cheap, and yours may vary, but the only reason not to put more RAM in is if you're doing very small images, web images only, or if your machine's already topped out. It can't hold more than 2 or 4. Video editors have a minimum of 8 to 16 gigabytes of RAM. They might even be running 32 or more. Now, the next important note here is GPU. On your computer, the CPU stands for Central Processing Unit. It's basically the engine of your computer. And the megahertz means how fast it is. But today, faster computers aren't really the ones with the fastest speed limit, or megahertz. They're the ones that have multiple CPUs, multiple core processors. And those processors are 64-bit. GPU stands for Graphics Processing Unit. It is dedicated for imaging. It's basically your video card, which is the link between your computer and what you're displaying on your screen or what you're editing or working on your monitor. An important note, if I click OK, under the Help menu, I can choose System Info and then scroll down a bit and see what operating system I'm running, how many processors I have, the speed, the built-in RAM memory. RAM memory runs on static electricity. Everything's instant. How much of that is free, how much Photoshop is using, and what percentage it's taken to. There's a lot more that you could surf through here in case you're curious, but that's all I wanted to overview to start. I'll click OK and come back to Photoshop, Preferences, Performance, or Edit Preferences Performance. And if you do not have a high-end video card, or you have not purchased additional VRAM or dedicated memory just for video-specific tasks, like 3D editing or rendering, or running filters, then this area will be grayed out. You won't see a checkbox that says you can use the graphics processor. PhotoshopCS6 has actually branded the calls that it makes to your graphics processor, the things that are very VRAM intensive. It's called the Monaco engine. So if you hear the Monaco engine, it means dedicated tasks are not being processed through your computer's engine, but they're going to your video card or your GPU, your graphics processing unit. There's an excellent white paper on adobe.com, and I'll flip over to my web browser really quickly, and I'll type Adobe Photoshop Performance and hit Return or Enter just at adobe.com, and you should be able to locate that white paper and read through it on your own. They are currently updating it for CS6, so keep an eye on adobe.com for that, and search just for Adobe Photoshop Performance. But back to Photoshop. The last few things that are very important is if you mouse over this graphics processor settings, you'll see features that only work if you have extra video RAM or an accelerated video card. And video cards could be $60 or $80, less than $100 for sure. Adding more VRAM to that will make you faster if you do run a lot of filters or 3D work. And here are some of the features that only work with accelerated video cards. The Rotate View tool, Bird's Eye Zooming, Scrubby Zoom, a Heads-Up Color Picker, a Sampling Ring, Oil Paint, which is new to CS6, lighting effects, which are very impressive in CS6, and all of the 3D enhancements like the blur gallery, some filters like liquify, or features under the edit menu like puppet warp. So you can read through the list down here of things that work with an accelerated video card. In summary, here are some tips that would help you improve Photoshop's performance. Firstly, if you only have 1 or 2 gigs of RAM, ask for more or purchase more. It's cheap enough and much less frustrating than watching progress bars. Secondly, add an accelerated video card if you don't have one. If you do have one, add more VRAM. If you only have 256 megs, go up to half a gig or 1 gig. And again, you could see that under Help, System Info. And you could tell how much video RAM you have from your card vendor. Third, separate Photoshop's scratch disk from the bootable operating system. If I come back to those performance preferences, you'll notice my machine is loaded up. I do a lot of video editing, so I have separate drives dedicated for video footage, and I could make the primary scratch disk a data drive. It'll be faster writing to one free drive of space than trying to jump to different spots on your startup drive that may have already had data written and erased from it many times. Fourth, don't run a lot of other programs when doing heavy Photoshop work. If you're working on really big images and you don't have sufficient RAM, that day or that morning, only run Photoshop and your performance will be improved. In fact, there's one last setting down here. If I go to Efficiency on the status bar, that number should always be 100%. If it falls below 100%, it's run out of real RAM memory, the fast static electricity memory, and is now reading and writing different sectors and tracks on your hard drive, and you could hear almost a popcorn noise coming from your computer, meaning it's working overtime. There's a couple final tips, but the last emergency tip I'll tell you is if you ever cannot save a file and you get an error message out of memory, you could try Edit, Purge, and purge all. You could purge just the histories, which is the undo. Your clipboard is anything that you've copied. You could purge one undo or all of the above. And now we have an option to purge video cache if you're doing video editing. But that is my tour of the things or terms that you need to get familiar with in order to make Photoshop run its fastest. The bottom line is there's no substitute for real RAM. If you don't have enough real RAM, Photoshop will work off of your hard disk. If you're running high-end features like complex filters or 3D work, you must purchase a video card with sufficient VRAM or dedicated RAM memory for video. So check your system settings on your own and show this video to your IT staff if they don't believe that you need more RAM. Good luck.